3 times. That is how many times the most powerful empire on earth went bankrupt in 40 years. Spain controlled half the world's gold and silver. They owned entire continents. Their army had never lost a major battle in Europe, and they still ran out of money 3 times before 1600. That story is not unique to Spain. Rome did it, Britain did it. Every empire that ever reached the top followed the exact same 7-stage pattern before collapsing. The pattern is so consistent that historians and economists can identify where any empire sits on the arc just by reading its economic data. The United States is at stage 5. That assessment comes from studying 500 years of financial history. And the closer you look, the harder it is to argue otherwise. It always begins the same way, a scrappy nation with nothing to lose. Rome in 500 BC was 7 hills surrounded by enemies on every side. Spain in 1400 was a divided kingdom that had spent 700 years fighting for its own survival. Britain in 1500 was a cold island that produced very little the world wanted. America in 1776 was 13 colonies that had just declared war against the most powerful military on earth. This is stage 1. Historians call it the Age of Pioneers. The nation has no comfort zone, no entitlement, no fat to protect. Every resource goes toward survival, innovation, or conquest. The people who build it are not comfortable. They are hungry. What defines every pioneer stage is one shared characteristic: rule of law built from scratch by people who had suffered from the absence of it. Rome created the 12 tables of law in 449 BC. America wrote a constitution in 1787 that became the template for dozens of nations that followed. Strong institutions built on merit are the foundation every future empire stands on. Stage 2 arrives when the hunger pays off. The nation starts winning consistently. Resources flow in, trade routes open, the military proves dominant. This is the wealth building stage, and it produces real, tangible value. Rome built aqueducts, roads, and grain systems that fed millions. Britain industrialized in the 1700s and produced goods that outcompeted every rival on earth. America emerged from World War II as the only major economy with its factories intact. In stage 2, the nation earns its dominance. It does not merely claim it. The wealth is backed by production, not promises. This distinction matters enormously because stage 3 is where the shift begins. Stage 3 is the age of finance. The empire has accumulated so much real wealth that it starts lending it. Banks appear, credit markets form. The nation transforms from the world's greatest producer into the world's greatest banker. This transition feels like progress, more money moving, faster, in every direction. But something quiet changes in the process. Britain made this shift in the 1800s. By 1850, London was not just the factory of the world, it was the bank of the world. The pound sterling became the global reserve currency. Every nation priced its trade in British pounds. That status gave Britain extraordinary power. It also gave Britain extraordinary temptation. When you can borrow at will because the world trusts your currency, the discipline that built your wealth starts to feel unnecessary. Stage 4 is peak empire. This is the moment that looks most impressive from the outside. The flag flies over the most territory. The currency dominates global trade. The military projects power on every continent. At peak stage, the British Empire covered 24% of the world's land surface. That was 1920, but beneath that surface, something had already broken. Britain had just finished World War I. The cost of that war was catastrophic. Britain borrowed massively to fight it, then borrowed more to rebuild. The debt did not kill the empire immediately. Empires rarely collapse the moment the debt appears. They collapse when the debt becomes the only tool left in the box. America's peak came after 1944. At Bretton Woods, 44 nations agreed to price global trade in US dollars. The dollar replaced the pound as the world's reserve currency. By 1950, America produced roughly half of the world's entire economic output. The dollar was backed by gold. The system was real. But peak stage always carries the seeds of what comes next. Ray Dalio spent decades studying this pattern. His conclusion: every empire at its peak begins to believe the peak is permanent. That belief is always the first step toward stage 5. Stage 5 begins with debt, not small debt, structural debt, debt that grows faster than the economy producing it. This is where Rome started dying. Under Emperor Nero in 64 AD, the Roman denarius was approximately 90% pure silver. Nero needed money for wars and spectacle. He found a clever solution. He reduced the silver content slightly. 150 years later, the denarius was under 60% silver. By around 300 AD, it had collapsed to less than 5%. The coin still looked like a denarius. It still carried the emperor's face, but the value had been hollowed out completely. Prices across the Roman Empire rose continuously as merchants figured out the coin was worth less than it claimed. Veterans who had served 30 years found their pensions bought half of what they had expected. Spain did something different but arrived at the same destination. They had actual silver. Between 1500 and 1650, Spain pulled an estimated 45,000 tons of silver out of the Americas and shipped it back to Europe. Too much silver chasing the same amount of goods means prices rise. Historians call this the price revolution. A loaf of bread that cost 1 unit in 1500 cost 3 by 1650. Spanish workers demanded higher wages to survive. Spanish goods became expensive. Cheaper goods from other nations started replacing Spanish products in every market. King Philip II inherited debts. Philip tried to spend his way to military dominance. On April 17, 1557, Philip II declared his first suspension of payments, 4 times in 40 years. Britain's Stage 5 came between the two world wars. Britain emerged victorious but economically exhausted. At Bretton Woods, America said no. The dollar won. The pound did not collapse overnight. By 1967, Britain was forced to devalue the pound by 14% overnight. Prime Minister Harold Wilson told people their pound in your pocket had not been devalued. Economists called it one of the most dishonest statements. The pound in your pocket bought 14% less. This is the precise moment every Stage 5 empire shares, when the leaders begin lying to the public about the currency. Now look at the United States. In 1944, the US dollar was backed by gold. In August 1971, President Nixon ended the gold convertibility. The world's reserve currency became overnight backed by nothing except the promise of the United States government. But the numbers are now undeniable. In 1999, the US dollar represented 71.2%. By 2024, that figure had declined to approximately 58%. The U.S. national debt crossed $37 trillion in 2025. This exceeds the entire annual GDP of the United States. The government now spends more servicing the interest on its debt than it spends on the entire U.S. defense budget. Stage 6 is where the cracks become visible to everyone. Social divisions widen. Political polarization reaches levels not seen in generations. The middle class begins to hollow out. The people who feel the loss of purchasing power first are always the same: teachers, veterans, families trying to save for a house that doubles in price every decade while wages grow by 3%. In Rome, the soldiers found their farms seized. In Spain, the artisans watched their savings evaporate. The pattern does not change because the human behavior driving it does not change. Power concentrated at the top protects itself. The currency is debased gradually. The debt is always described as temporary. The leaders always say the fundamentals are strong. Stage 7 is the transition. Sometimes it is a long, slow redistribution of global power. Britain in 1920 controlled a quarter of the earth. Britain in 1960 was managing a dignified but real retreat. America still holds enormous advantages: a reserve currency, the world's most powerful military, deep capital markets. None of them, however, have ever stopped the pattern from completing. They have only ever slowed the timeline. The pattern that destroyed Rome, Spain, and Britain is not a conspiracy. It is a documented, recurring sequence of financial decisions. History does not repeat exactly, but it rhymes with a precision that should make every generation uncomfortable. The question is never whether the pattern is real. The question is whether anyone in a position to act on it ever chooses to. The most dangerous stage of any empire is not the fall. It is the moment when the fall is still preventable. But prevention requires admitting something no one in power wants to say out loud.